What if the city that built modern global finance is quietly losing the very people who made it rich? For 300 years, London was the address every serious fortune wanted on its letterhead. Kings, oil barons, hedge fund titans, and tech billionaires all found their way to the same postcode. But something has shifted, and it did not happen quietly. Right now, in 2026, a record 165,000 millionaires are expected to pack up and move to a new country, the largest movement of private wealth ever recorded in human history. And the numbers tell a brutal story for one city in particular. Britain is projected to lose around 16,500 millionaires this year alone, the single largest net outflow any country has ever tracked. Meanwhile, 7,000 miles away, a tiny island nation smaller than New York City is pulling in family offices, billionaires, and entire investment portfolios at a pace nobody predicted a decade ago. This is the story of two cities, one crown that is slipping, and one upstart that is rewriting the map of global money. Stay with me, because by the end of this you will understand exactly why the wealthy are voting with their feet, and where they are going. Point 1. The tax change that broke the camel's back. To understand why money is fleeing London, you have to understand one policy decision, and it is bigger than most people realize. For over 200 years, the United Kingdom operated something called the non-domiciled tax status, or non-dom for short. It allowed wealthy foreigners living in Britain to avoid paying UK tax on income and gains earned outside the country, sometimes indefinitely, as long as they did not bring that money on shore. This single rule turned London into a magnet. Russian oligarchs, Gulf royalty, Indian industrialists, and American financiers all settled in Mayfair and Kensington because they could enjoy British life, British schools, and British courts, while keeping their global fortunes largely untouched by the taxman. Then in April 2025, that entire system was abolished. Under the new rules, anyone living in the UK now gets only 4 years of tax-free treatment on foreign wealth, down from what was effectively an unlimited exemption for many. Existing non-doms were given a short transition window of about 2 years to adjust. For families with fortunes spanning generations, this was not a small tweak, it was an earthquake. Advisors described clients who had lived in London for 20 or 30 years suddenly running the numbers and realizing they could save tens of millions of pounds a year simply by relocating. The psychological effect was just as important as the financial one. Wealthy families do not like uncertainty, and many felt the rules could change again with little warning. So they did what capital always does when it feels unwelcome, it moved. Analysts now estimate that each millionaire who leaves the UK takes with them an average of roughly £394,000 in annual income tax contributions, which is the equivalent of losing 49 ordinary taxpayers every single time one wealthy family packs their bags. Multiply that by 16,500 departures and you start to see the scale of what Britain is losing, not just in glamour, but in hard government revenue. Point 2. Singapore's quiet climb to the top. While London was absorbing the shock of losing its signature tax advantage, Singapore was doing something very different. It was patiently building the exact environment that displaced wealth was looking for. According to the 2026 Henley Private Wealth Migration Report, Singapore now scores 79.5 out of 100 on what is called the Wealth Mobility Competitiveness Score, placing it among the very top destinations on Earth for internationally mobile fortunes. That score is not an accident, it reflects a deliberate multi-decade strategy. The framework used to measure this looks at taxation, investor migration pathways, quality of life, rule of law, family inclusion, geopolitical stability, and capital mobility, and Singapore performs strongly across nearly every single category. It is one of the only major financial centers in the world that combines political stability with genuinely low, predictable taxation, deep and liquid capital markets, and a government that treats wealthy residents as long-term partners rather than temporary guests to be taxed harder each budget cycle. Reports describe the wealthy individual of 2026 as no longer choosing a single country to call home, but instead building what is called a portfolio of jurisdictions, spreading their residency, their business registration, and their assets across multiple friendly locations. In that portfolio, Singapore has become the anchor for Asia and increasingly for global capital as well. The city-state has consolidated its position as one of the world's leading wealth hubs, underpinned by strong institutions, a stable government that has not changed hands in a way that spooks markets, and sustained demand from ultra-wealthy families across mainland China, Hong Kong, India, and increasingly the Middle East and the West. It is worth pausing on how remarkable this is. Singapore has no natural resources, a tiny domestic population, and almost no land. Yet through sheer policy discipline, it has become the destination that some of the richest families on the planet now consider their most trusted base. Point 3. The family office explosion. If you want a single number that captures the scale of Singapore's rise, look at family offices. A family office is essentially a private company set up to manage the fortune of one wealthy family, handling investments, tax planning, philanthropy, and succession across generations. In 2020, Singapore had roughly 400 of these single-family offices registered. By the end of 2024, that number had crossed 2,000, and it kept climbing through 2025, representing something close to a 400% increase in just 4 years. That is not gradual growth, that is a stampede. Combined assets under management across these Singapore-based family offices reached around $66.8 billion, a jump of over 43% in a single year. To put that in perspective, Singapore now hosts close to 60% of all family offices located anywhere in Asia. This growth has been fueled by tax incentive schemes run by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which offer exemptions on qualifying investment income as long as the family office employs local staff and meets minimum spending requirements in the country. Families need a minimum of around $10 million in investable assets just to qualify for the smallest tier, and the largest tier requires 200 million Singapore dollars in assets under management. These are not casual movers, these are serious fortunes making a serious commitment. High-profile figures have made the move too, including major global investors who shifted key operations to Singapore, buying up historic properties in the city as both an investment and a symbolic anchor for their Asian operations. Meanwhile, London has struggled to build anything close to this kind of dedicated wealth infrastructure at the same pace. The contrast is stark. One city is watching its wealthy residents quietly wind down their UK-based structures, while the other is approving new family office applications at a record clip almost every single month. Point 4. Two very different philosophies on tax. At the heart of this entire story is a fundamental disagreement about how a country should treat its wealthiest residents, and London and Singapore have landed on opposite sides. Britain's approach in recent years has leaned toward the idea that the wealthy should contribute a larger, more visible share, especially as the country grapples with strained public finances, an aging population, and pressure to fund healthcare and social services. The abolition of the non-dom regime was framed by policymakers as a matter of fairness, closing what critics called a loophole that let extremely rich foreign residents avoid contributing their fair share while enjoying British infrastructure and security. There is a genuine and reasonable debate here. Supporters of the reform argue it raises much-needed revenue and closes an outdated colonial-era exemption, while critics argue it has backfired by driving away the very tax base it was meant to capture more of. Singapore, on the other hand, has built its entire economic identity around predictability and restraint. Personal income tax rates remain relatively low compared to Western Europe, there is no capital gains tax on most investments, and the government has structured multiple visa and investment pathways specifically designed to welcome global wealth rather than discourage it. Programs tied to the Global Investor Program require substantial capital commitments, often 200 million Singapore dollars or more, but in exchange offer residency and a stable long-term environment that families can plan around for decades. The lesson many wealth advisors draw from this comparison is not necessarily that low tax always wins, but that consistency wins. Wealthy families can plan around high tax if they know the rules will not change every few years. What they cannot plan around is sudden, sweeping reform that alters the calculation overnight, and that is precisely the reputation London has been fighting to shake off since 2025. Point 5. London's stock market is shrinking too. The wealth exodus is not just about individual millionaires quietly relocating, it is playing out on a much bigger stage, the London Stock Exchange itself. In 2024 alone, 88 companies either delisted from London or relocated their primary listing elsewhere, the largest outflow in more than a decade. That trend has only accelerated into 2026. Flutter Entertainment, the owner of FanDuel, confirmed it will fully delist from London in August, keeping only its New York listing. Wise, the fintech giant built by British entrepreneurs, secured shareholder approval to shift its primary listing to the United States entirely, citing a need for deeper capital markets and greater global visibility. Even AstraZeneca, one of Britain's most iconic pharmaceutical companies, launched a direct listing on the New York Stock Exchange in February 2026, while trying to reassure the public it was not abandoning London altogether. The list of companies that have shifted away in recent years reads like a roll call of British corporate pride, including Ashted, Just Eat Takeaway, Peters Hill Partners, Indivior, and Woodside Energy. Over the past 10 years, London has lost roughly 800 listed companies in total. The reasons companies give are strikingly consistent: undervaluation compared to peers listed in New York, lower liquidity, a shrinking pool of domestic institutional investors, and lingering uncertainty tied to the long-tail effects of Brexit. When public companies leave a stock exchange, it is not just symbolic, it removes trading volume, advisory fees, listing revenue, and prestige, all of which feed into whether the next generation of ambitious companies chooses to list in London at all. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle: fewer big listings mean less liquidity, which makes the exchange less attractive, which then discourages the next wave of companies from listing there in the first place, pushing them toward New York or increasingly toward Asian exchanges instead. Point 6. Singapore has quietly overtaken London in millionaires. Here is a statistic that would have sounded absurd 15 years ago: Singapore is now home to more millionaires than London. According to Henley & Partners, Singapore currently hosts around 244,800 millionaires, a figure that has already surpassed the British capital. Singapore is also ranked as the fourth wealthiest city in the world by total private wealth held by its residents, again ahead of London in that same ranking. The city is home to 47 billionaires, an extraordinary concentration for a nation of just 5.5 million people. Projections suggest that by 2030, more than 13% of Singapore's population, close to 700,000 people, will be classified as millionaires, which would make it the wealthiest city per capita anywhere in the Asia-Pacific region. This did not happen by luck. It reflects 2 decades of consistent policy, heavy investment in financial infrastructure, and a government willing to court global capital aggressively while London was distracted by referendums, leadership changes, and shifting tax policy. There is something almost symbolic about this crossover point. London built its reputation on being the bridge between European and American capital for centuries. Singapore built its reputation on being the bridge between Chinese, Indian, and increasingly Middle Eastern capital flowing into the rest of the world. As economic gravity continues shifting toward Asia, that bridge has become enormously valuable, and the millionaires flocking there are simply following the flow of opportunity, much like traders followed the flow of goods through Singapore's port for the last 2 centuries. The city is no longer just a regional hub, it has become a genuine rival to the historic capitals of Western finance, and the millionaire numbers prove it is not hype. Point 7. Stability, safety, and the quiet comfort of predictability. Money does not just chase returns, it chases peace of mind, and this is where Singapore has built one of its most underrated advantages. The city-state consistently ranks among the safest places on Earth, with extremely low crime rates, a highly efficient and largely incorruptible legal system, and a government that has maintained the same basic economic direction for decades. For wealthy families who have spent generations building a fortune, the single greatest fear is often not taxation, it is chaos, unpredictable courts, sudden expropriation, political instability, or a legal system that cannot be trusted to enforce a contract fairly. Singapore offers almost the opposite of chaos. Its courts are respected internationally for commercial dispute resolution, its currency has remained remarkably stable, and its government has avoided the kind of dramatic policy swings that have unsettled investors in Europe and parts of the West. London, by contrast, has spent the last decade navigating an unusually turbulent stretch, a divisive Brexit vote, multiple changes in prime ministers within a few short years, shifting tax policy, and ongoing debates about the country's fiscal direction. None of these events individually would drive capital away, but together they create a cumulative sense of unpredictability that wealthy families notice and plan around. Education is another quiet factor. Singapore has invested heavily in world-class international schools that appeal directly to relocating families, offering curricula recognized globally so that children can move seamlessly between countries later in life. Add an excellent healthcare, low pollution compared to many rival cities, and a strategic location that puts you within a short flight of nearly every major Asian market, and you start to understand why families are not just moving their money to Singapore, they are moving their entire lives there, their children, their staff, and their long-term plans for the next generation. Point 8. The global numbers behind the Great Wealth Shuffle. Zoom out, and this rivalry between two cities is actually part of a much larger global story. The Henley Private Wealth Migration Report for 2026 projects that 165,000 millionaires will relocate across borders this year, up from about 142,000 in 2025, and 134,000 in 2024. A decade ago, in 2013, that number was only around 51,000 people. In other words, global millionaire migration has more than tripled in just over 10 years, and the pace keeps accelerating. The United Arab Emirates remains the single largest magnet for this money, expected to gain roughly 9,800 net millionaires this year, the top destination for the fifth year running. The United States still pulls in a strong net gain of around 7,500, even as it simultaneously loses citizens who renounce their status at record levels. Italy has emerged as one of Europe's standout winners with a net gain of around 3,600, largely thanks to a flat tax regime designed specifically to attract wealthy foreigners. Switzerland, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore round out the next tier of major winners. On the losing side, the picture is just as dramatic. Britain's projected net outflow of around 16,500 millionaires is the largest single-country loss ever tracked by researchers, but it is not alone. China is expected to lose around 7,800, India around 3,500, and South Korea around 2,400, largely due to common prosperity policies, geopolitical tension, and shifting tax environments in those countries too. One economist described high net worth migration as the canary in the coal mine for economic policy, arguing that when wealthy people leave a country in large numbers, it is usually a reliable signal that something in that country's underlying policy direction is not working the way leaders hoped it would. Point 9. Real estate and the physical footprint of fleeing money. You can actually watch this wealth migration happen in bricks and mortar, and the property markets of both cities tell the story vividly. In London, prime central neighborhoods like Mayfair, Belgravia, and Knightsbridge, once considered untouchable investments, have seen noticeably softer demand and, in some cases, falling prices since the non-dom changes took effect. Estate agents have described a rise in high-end properties sitting on the market for months longer than usual, with sellers reluctantly cutting asking prices to attract the shrinking pool of ultra-wealthy buyers still interested in a London base. Meanwhile in Singapore, the opposite pattern has been unfolding. Good-class bungalows, the city's most exclusive category of landed housing reserved largely for citizens and permanent residents, have continued trading at extraordinary prices, and demand for luxury condominiums from newly arrived wealthy families has remained resilient even as the government has repeatedly raised stamp duty specifically aimed at cooling foreign buying. That the government felt the need to keep tightening these rules tells you everything about the sheer volume of incoming capital chasing Singapore property. Historic shophouses in districts like Club Street have become particularly prized, not just as homes but as symbolic anchors for family offices setting up their Asian headquarters. Beyond residential property, commercial real estate has followed the same pattern, with prime office space in Singapore's financial district commanding strong rents even as some London office towers have struggled with post-pandemic vacancy rates and slower return to office trends. Property, more than almost any other asset, reflects where people genuinely plan to live and raise families, not just where they park spare cash, and on that measure, the physical footprint of global wealth is visibly shifting eastward, brick by brick, deal by deal. Point 10. What this rivalry means for the next decade. So where does this leave the two cities looking forward? London is not disappearing, it remains one of the great financial capitals of the world, home to deep legal expertise, a globally trusted language and legal system, and centuries of institutional memory that cannot be replicated overnight. But it is clearly no longer the automatic, uncontested default for global wealth that it was even 15 years ago. British policymakers now face a genuine dilemma. They need revenue to fund public services, yet the data increasingly shows that squeezing the wealthiest residents too hard risks losing far more in departed tax contributions than any single reform gains in the short term. Some economists argue Britain may eventually need to soften parts of the new regime to stem further losses, though any reversal would carry its own political cost. Singapore, for its part, faces a different kind of challenge, managing the side effects of rapid success. Housing costs for ordinary residents have risen alongside the wealth boom, creating quiet tension between welcoming global capital and preserving affordability for citizens who were born there. Global asset management is projected to grow from around $139 trillion in 2024 to roughly $200 trillion by 2030, meaning the prize both cities are competing for keeps getting bigger every single year. What is clear is that this is no longer a story about one city simply losing and another simply winning, it is a fundamental reshuffling of where global capital feels safest, most respected, and most confident about the future. The families making these choices are not driven by headlines or short-term politics, they are making multi-generational bets on which system will still be standing, stable, and predictable in 30 or 40 years. Right now, more of them are placing that bet on Singapore than at any point in modern history, and that single fact is reshaping the balance of global finance in real time. So there it is, the full picture of how one small island nation quietly outmaneuvered one of the oldest financial capitals on Earth. This is not just a story about rich people and their money, it is a story about what happens when policy, stability, and trust collide with a rapidly shifting global economy, and the ripple effects reach all of us through jobs, investment, and the future shape of entire cities. If this deep dive opened your eyes to something you did not know before, do me a huge favor and smash that like button right now, it genuinely helps this channel grow and reach more curious minds just like you. I want to know what you think, so drop a comment below. Do you believe London can turn this around, or has the crown already permanently shifted to Singapore? I read every single comment and I love hearing different perspectives on this. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we are covering the biggest shifts in global money, power, and cities like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, it truly means everything. Now go hit like, drop that comment, and I will see you in the very next video.